Good afternoon, and welcome to the Cleveland Museum of Art on this beautiful fall afternoon. I'm Barbara Tannenbaum, the museum's curator of photography, and it's my privilege to introduce today's program. But first, I want to invite you for our next event. Who here collects? Let's see some hands. Wooden spoons, rare scotches, Beanie Babies, anything. Come on, confess, confess. Why do you collect? And what personal value do your collections hold? These are the questions that will be discussed at The Art of Collecting, which will be held here in Gartner Auditorium on Friday, November 11th at 6 p.m. Join CMA Chief Curator Heather Lamonides-Brown, comic book collector Benjamin Joines-Mundy, sneaker collector and authenticator Sidel Moore, and music critic and record collector Annie Zaleski for a conversation about the passion that drives collecting. That program is organized in conjunction with the exhibition Impressionism to Modernism, the Keithley Collection. Now, I hope that a lot of you have seen the exhibition Matt Eich and Tyler Mitchell, Sunshine, Shadow, and a Rainbow. Organized as part of Front, the International Triennial of Contemporary Art, it's on view through November 6th in the Schwartz and Katz Photography Gallery on the museum's second floor, which is Gallery 230. And it is the inspiration for today's event, a conversation between artist Tyler Mitchell and the museum's Associate Curator of American Art, Ki-Jo Lee. All education programs at the Cleveland Museum of Art are underwritten by the CMA Fund for Education. A full list of our generous donors is available on the screen above me, and we are very grateful for their support. Today's program is made possible by the Fran and Warren Rupp Contemporary Artists Fund. We are very grateful to the Rupp family for this generous endowment, which allows us to provide Northeast Ohio audiences, you guys, with direct access to today's leading visual artists. Rupp funding also allows us to offer you a special treat. Immediately following the program, please join Tyler and Ki-Jo for light refreshments in the museum's private dining room, which is located down the hallway to the left of the cafe in the atrium. And now, on to the main event. I'm going to make my introductions short so you can spend more time with Tyler and Ki-Jo. My treasured colleague, Ki-Jo Lee, who has a decade of experience as a teacher and museum educator, arrived at the CMA in June 2017. Last July, she was named Associate Curator of American Art. She specializes in American art and visual cultures and photographic history and theory, researching topics including 19th century photography and portraiture, interdisciplinary art histories, new materialism, and Black abstraction. Ki-Jo received a BA in art history from Douglas College and an MA in the history of art and African American studies at Yale. And she is currently a PhD candidate in the history of art and African American studies at Yale and very close to finishing her dissertation. Her first museum publication, Perceptual Drift, Black Art and the Ethics of Looking, will be available in November in the museum shop. Now, I hope many of you have already experienced the art of our very honored guest, Tyler Mitchell. His photographs, as I said, are on view upstairs right now in the photo gallery, and others were on view last summer in the Smith Gallery downstairs in The New Black Vanguard, Photography Between Art and Fashion. Based in Brooklyn, Tyler holds a BFA in film and television from NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. In 2018, he made history as the first Black photographer to shoot a cover of American Vogue for Beyoncé's appearance in that all-important September issue. The following year, a portrait from the series was acquired by the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery for its permanent collection. And his work is also part of the permanent collection of the CMA. In 2021, we purchased Riverside Scene, which is on view upstairs. Tyler has been a visiting artist and lecturer at a number of institutions, including Yale, Harvard, NYU, Paris Photo, and the International Center of Photography. His work introduces new narratives about Black beauty and desire, embracing themes of the past, and creating fictionalized moments of an imagined future. Tyler uses photography, which is most often associated with recording fact, to suggest the power of the imagination and the possibility of tangible transformation through it. Please join me in welcoming Tyler Mitchell and Ki-Jo Lee.
everyone. Tyler, it's so wonderful to be in conversation with you today. And before we jump into images, I thought that what we should do is maybe talk a little bit more about, I'm always interested in what anchors someone's practice. So what are the go-to thinkers, artists, ideas, people that sort of anchor what you do and what you convey?
Yeah, well, thank you also to Barbara and to the Cleveland Museum of Art and everyone who's hosted me here. This is my first time in Cleveland, and to Kijo for being in conversation with me. But yeah, I guess the people who anchor what I do in my practice, really it started with filmmaking and filmmakers first. Growing up in Atlanta, I was introduced mostly to film through my father. He showed me all sorts of classical Hollywood sort of things, Alfred Hitchcock, but also noir and movie sort of murder mystery films. And then I myself got obsessed with skateboarding and this idea of filmmaking and filming the sport of skateboarding. So a lot of my first anchors, I would say, were image makers who were mostly doing moving image. So Spike Jonze, Steve McQueen, Paul Thomas Anderson, a lot of people who I saw as these people who existed in multiple realms of filmmaking. Spike Jonze was making commercial work. He was also making feature films. They were often very artistically connected. And then later, as I was telling you a little bit earlier, I got introduced to Deborah Willis, who is head of the photo department at NYU, where I went to school. And she introduced me to a whole pantheon of sort of black image makers like Gordon Parks, Roy DeCarava, even Carrie Mae Weems, early Hudnall Jr., and so many photographers, but mainly photographers and filmmakers who anchor and root what I do.
Okay, yeah. And then thinking about things like skateboarding videos, that's a really particular aesthetic. So, I grew up in the 80s when things were a camcorder, these huge video cameras that you would be on the street capturing kids skateboarding, and then you bought the VHS out of somebody's trunk. So, but thinking about that particular kind of pared down, is that part of what appealed?
Yeah, that appealed to me, and sort of the idea of, I guess in that, when I was being exposed to skateboarding videos, it was less of a camcorder type of aesthetic, but it was transitioning into this sort of DSLR sort of thing where cameras had often a picture mode and a video mode all at once. And so the camera that I encountered first was a friend's camera, which had both. And so I became equally obsessed with this idea of digital or high definition video making, but also digital picture making. And so the two mediums kind of came to me at once. And I really became interested in both equally, I think. But yeah, I do like the idiosyncratic element of skateboard filmmaking. I like the idea of how individualistic the style can be. It's not like filming a basketball game per se, where it's quite prescribed. It's really about the perspective of the filmer as much as it is about the style of the skater. And it felt like a style thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it makes sense. Maybe we'll go to our first slide.
Oh, that's me.
That film and photography sort of appeal to you simultaneously makes sense, because there seems to be a real cinematic quality to your photographs. And what we're showing here is Riverside Scene, which is in the CMA's collection and which is on view now. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, as part of thinking about those anchors in your practice, not only the people, but what ideas are you hoping to convey, and where do they come from for you?
Yeah, well, I think as you kind of just touched on, I really love the idea of photographs as sort of storytelling tools, right? As sort of riding the line for me of fact and fiction a little bit, as stories being capable of being more true than the truth itself sometimes, right? And this idea of specifically, again, in meeting Deb and sort of taking her class and being a disciple, I would say, of her teachings, I started to really think deeply about photo as a tool that could really talk about personhood, talk about these ideas of what it means to be young and black in today's world, what it means to be young and black in America, and so, but also expanding those narratives. So works like Riverside Scene, what's literally being depicted there is several families, interacting with one another, several families, lines, generations of women, brothers, mother and a daughter, as well as the act of artistic creation itself within the frame of the photograph. So there's almost this notion of togetherness, and also this expansive notion of many things being possible in one moment, right? Many moments of enjoyment, right? Leisure,
Yes.
happening in one frame. So all of those things came to me from looking at sort of pictures over time and seeing what I liked in images and thinking about expanding notions of what the canon of what we know of as images of black people today could be. So.
Yeah, because there's almost a vintage quality to this aesthetic. To me, though, it's very contemporary, but there seems to be, and I shouldn't even say vintage, maybe it's almost timeless, because it could be the 50s, it could be yesterday.
Yeah.
And so there's also this untitled piece that's on view. So there seems to be this kind of space in which you have, like in Riverside, something that feels very familiar, something that you would anticipate seeing, very bucolic. But here with this untitled piece, the context becomes more abstract. And I think we get a sense of a little bit where fashion might come to play in your work. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about this work in particular from 2019.
Yeah, well, this was, I think I like to, again, oscillate between these very bucolic or beautiful moments and also these very heightened, playful, or almost like surreal or theatrical moments, all of which I find not only fun to make, but also possible for, black folks to exist in. So these particular images were actually made for English. This was the only, I think it's one of the only commissioned works in this particular exhibition at the Cleveland Museum, but I make a lot of work in fashion as well as my own personal work, and this particular image was made for an English brand called J.W. Anderson. So J.W. Anderson is headed by this fashion designer named Jonathan Anderson, who's an Irish-English fashion designer, and he already has a very playful sensibility in his clothes. So a lot of times with fashion work, it's about sort of working with and understanding how my voice ricochets against the work of a fashion designer and how we can come together with something interesting visually. And that particular image, it was exciting to me to make a campaign for him that was about almost quite literally heightening, right, in the landscape, these young black women who had never been photographed before for any sort of fashion campaign. So all four of those girls are basically people we street casted and found in different parts of Europe that had different African diasporic backgrounds, Somalian, even sort of Afro-Indian, Caribbean. And so we found four girls that we felt were really great protagonists and thought it would be great to sort of quite surreal and theatrically heighten them on these stilts. I think I'd found some images, some reference images of people on stilts playing on a beach, and I just thought that could be a beautiful thing to play with. So,
Yes, absolutely, and that sort of surreal nature of having them in this open field, but that also, this idea of the body in nature seems to be a thread that goes throughout your work. And so also really happy to hear about how things like a commission might work and allow you as an artist to continue to have your voice show through and have a collaborative voice with whatever brand it is that you're hoping to represent. And so this is one of my favorite works that's on view here. And because of the materiality, we're trying to capture that movement that you see when you're actually in the galleries as this is printed on fabric. So I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about both the image, the process of creating this particular work, and what it says about your work at this moment in time, at that sort of 2019, 2020 moment.
So these works essentially in late 2019, I worked with curator Isolde Brielle-Meyer, who at the time was a curator at the International Center of Photography in New York, and she invited me to do a show at the first, essentially the first exhibition in the ICP's new building in New York. So she showed me the space, and we thought, okay, great, maybe things could go here, things could go there. As you know, you start to look at what works could work in what spaces, and there was a long, narrow, 60-foot hallway that I didn't quite know what to do with, that felt a little bit awkward. You couldn't really put framed photographs in there because you wouldn't stop in this hallway. You would kind of walk down it, and you wouldn't really have the distance to appreciate a photograph. So I was experimenting with printing on fabric, and up in the show here, this work is printed on a sort of a poly silk fabric. I started to play with printing photographs on fabric because fabric already played a role in my photographs. So I had made images before of figures sort of posing with and in front of fabrics as backdrops themselves, right, as this sort of storytelling tool. A lot of them were patterned or printed or from certain backgrounds. We were just talking about me falling in love with G's Bend quilts growing up in Atlanta. And I think fabric just became a storytelling role. I think this idea of laundry as a outdoor sort of poetic and beautiful space, but also that makes reference to a domesticity, right? Working black folks. It became a thing that I could do. So with the 60-foot hallway, I thought I should make a laundry line installation down it rather than putting framed photographs, and that's what started this part of my practice. And this work in particular thinks of both the form and the content as being married, because we see the gingham fabric sort of framing these group of boys in the landscape, and gingham obviously bringing forth all these ideas of Southern identity, picnics, right, enjoyment, leisure, and all of the things that I'm kind of preoccupied with.
Yeah, beautiful. I also appreciate in the galleries the way that it allows the viewer to participate, because as you move, it moves, or also the apparatus of the gallery is less invisible because the air ducts and things cause this fabric to waft as well. So I also really enjoy the ways that it brings our bodies into interaction with the image as well. And so I promised that we would talk a little bit about what the sources of your practice and where you were here, but let's talk a little bit about where you are at this moment in 2022 and what's going on right now. So you currently have two exhibitions, or actually I guess Frieze is closed. So you have an exhibition on view at Gagosian in London called Chrysalis. And so I think that everyone would also maybe be interested in, so now Gagosian is one of the largest art dealers, galleries in the world. And so how do you get from Atlanta, Georgia, right, to, they're just offering me shows at ICA in New York. And so I think we have, quite a few students also in the space that would be really interested in that trajectory. And then we can go more into the work, but.
Yeah, well, it's funny how it does feel quite like a leap, but to me it felt very organic because there's somebody who works now at Gagosian Gallery, Antoine Sargent, who is a curator, is a writer, is a friend. I knew him from his writing about black artists. I think especially at a time in New York where there weren't many writers pioneering that sort of work. And this isn't even that long ago. This is 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. There were very few writers who were interested in doing studio visits with black artists in New York. Very few writers who were interested in covering and bringing what they were doing to large publications. I think he was writing a bit for Artforum, he was writing a bit for Aperture, he was writing for The New Yorker, and I'd read his writing and essentially reached out, and I knew that he was on a jury 4 or 5 years ago for an exhibition at Aperture Foundation, which is in New York. There was an open call exhibition that was basically saying, submit your work if you're if you're not represented, if you're not with a gallery or a photo agency or anything like that, submit your work, and we're doing an open call exhibition, a group exhibition. And Antoine was on the jury for that. There were several other people, great curators and writers on the jury, but Antoine I reached out to and said, I think I'm interested in not only making work for magazines and brands, but I think I'm also interested in showing it in galleries and museums, and how does that work, and what do you know about that? And I think it could be something I could do. He became a friend who basically was leading me through this process together, and now it's become a 5-year friendship where he's got a job as a director at this gallery. We've been doing shows together and projects together for 5 years, and so he asked if I would do this one project with his gallery in London, with Gagosian Gallery in London, and so that's how this show came about. And I made all of this work specifically for the exhibition because him and I have a dialogue.
Yes. So, and we'll get to the dialogue between the images, but it's really important that, you know, you sort of struck out, reached out, and established that kind of relationship. Those of you in the audience may be familiar with Antoine Sargent from the New Black Vanguard show that was on view here at the CMA really recently. Yeah. And so I got to see the show in person, and it's really beautiful. It's like a little jewel box of a show. Yeah. And this is the view from the street. And so I wanted to just show two of the pairings that are on one of the main walls here, and then maybe we could break them down a little bit because the juxtapositions are fairly stark, and there are ways in which the fullness of the body becomes abstracted through dirt and sand in this really interesting way. So maybe you could talk about Cage and Tenderly.
Yeah, these works, I guess. I'm now beginning to make work specifically with exhibitions in mind, or now beginning to make bodies of works with specific exhibitions in mind. And this particular body, I started to really think about the bucolic nature of what I was doing, right? My fixation or my obsession with this idea of expanding the narrative vis-a-vis capturing Black folks in nature, right? My Southern upbringing, right? The nature being just a part of myself and who I am. But I also started thinking about the beautiful elements of that, but also sort of the threatening elements of that psychologically. So these photographs almost enter this more surreal, self-contained world in which I'm talking more about a certain sort of mindset or a certain sort of psychological state of being. And what I mean by that is these photographs are of people that I've sort of casted and asked to play as protagonists or play roles in the photographs. This young girl, Fanta is her name, I asked if she would sort of pose in front of what is sort of a typical photo studio painted scenic backdrop that, you know, families would essentially pose in front of. Throughout time, you think of James Van Der Zee or James Barner.
Yes, so even as early as the 19th century, like from the onset of photography and the way that we see it, they were using these kinds of faux backdrops.
Yeah. So they had a sort of hokey quality to them, but they also have a beauty to them. Like, there really is something special to the way that we pose in front of these aspirational settings, right? And the title Cage also being this sort of enclosure of the environment, the all-enveloping nature of the environment. So I think these works experience at once the beautiful elements of the outdoors, but also the threatening ones.
Yeah, because as I was looking at, you know, these ideas of the beautiful picnic outdoors, perhaps it's my own sensibility, but I immediately think of the dangers of being outdoors, exposed, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so there was that edge that I felt between those images, specifically in this show. And I think it continues a bit here in these juxtapositions, but I'm particularly interested in the ways that you have the body interacting with water and with sand. So we can go here or here.
Yeah, I mean, I started to think of this, as I started to make work, I mean, I was making work over the past year. So I was making a little bit, I would make a picture or two, I would try out another idea. A lot of it was made in New York, although I tried to make a lot of the pictures less about place and more about sort of mental place and sort of psychological place. Even though I was making the work in New York, I was starting to understand that the work was very clearly about elements, natural elements very directly. So what I mean by that is water or sky, grass, picket fence even, these elements that are very fundamental and foundational to American landscape, to Southern landscape, and how Black people interact with them, how they position themselves in relationship to them, how we move through them. So water and mud being like very important symbols that call forth all these connotations of, right, swimming, traveling through water, traveling across the ocean, right, whether that be the slave trade or whether that also be these ideas of baptism, right? So none of those things are directly in the pictures, but the idea that I'm working in relationship to a canon of images of Black folks that's come before me, those symbols come to mind naturally, I think. So these images kind of call those things forth. And the tire swing as well, yeah. So.
Yeah, but there's also this kind of precarity, right, to even that position.
Yeah.
And I was really taken with flotation. And what I did was blow many of these up so that they're the same size as each other, but there's also the juxtaposition in size and scale, absolutely. Let me see if I can, I'll come back to that, but let's see if I can show. So you can see the distinction truly in the size between the two images. So this notion of interiority. So not quite thought bubbles, but this sort of projection inward rather than outward.
Yeah, there's these combinations of almost mental moments, right? I don't know how I could describe them other than moments that I could speak from my point of view, which was growing up in Atlanta, you know, there was this thing of almost behavioral posturing sometimes where you felt like, am I meant to be here? Or for fear of stepping into this type of place outdoors in Atlanta, would there be danger, right? Even caution that my parents had around how to dress or how to present in certain public spaces. I think these diptychs photographically bring out some of those considerations, some of those hesitations that happen psychologically. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And so as we are flipping through these images, I keep seeing the same young man.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, and I prompted you earlier to say I was going to ask you about the idea of muses.
Yeah.
So I think of, as you've described your relationship with Deb Willis, I think of her as perhaps one of your muses, not just a touchstone, but perhaps someone who allows your imagination to go into new directions. And so I was wondering about the young people who appear in your images, particularly this young man, and the idea of muses in your work.
Yeah, well, he's a photographer, actually. So I also like this idea of photographing artists, photographing other creative people who understand the process of making images or who can understand playing a role in images. But most of the protagonists, so that's kind of how I call them, or muses, or sort of however you want to refer to it as, most of them are people who inspire me not only with their gaze or sort of visual things, but also with their sort of stature, behavior, personhood, way of carrying themselves. I mean, a lot of the work, especially being that most of this body of work is of young men, touches on and talks about masculinity in a way. I think touches on the delicate elements of masculinity. But I think that muses, and this idea of muses and protagonists, sort of, I cast people more like a director casts actors a little bit. I think that I'm looking for people who have a certain quality that's almost like an actor who can play a role within this world. So it's a little more of that relationship than it is sort of like a model photographer relationship, or it is sort of like even a family relationship. It's much more, we're playing fantasy together almost as director and actor a little bit. Yeah.
Beautiful. And thank you for bringing up this idea of the softness around masculinity, or thinking about Black masculinity in a different way. And we can come back to these, but I was particularly taken with this work, Chrysalis, this figure in repose. And so I wonder if you could maybe expand a little bit on what you are thinking about and the ways in which you are depicting young Black men in your images.
Yeah, I'm interested in images that have a quietness to them, that have a sort of a repose to them, a restfulness, a meditative kind of quality. I mean, Chrysalis is this idea of cocooning, right, or sort of being in a state of transformation. from quite literally by definition, caterpillar to butterfly, but all those references and connotations are in these photographs. And I mean, the mosquito net being a sort of powerful diasporic symbol, right? Because you'd go to sort of, I've slept in mosquito nets personally when I've gone to places like Jamaica or even South Africa, which I went to once. Essentially, I love that symbol calls forth already the diaspora in this way, but also this idea of cocooning and rest and sort of closing oneself off from the world and taking a moment for oneself. So all those ideas are things that I feel are important to me, but also things that I haven't seen enough in photographs. And they're values that I think hopefully expand notions around how Black men, Black people could take space for themselves and actually like look more to an interiority, which I think is a conversation that should be had, you know? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the mosquito netting as well, that way of even filtering our view on the figure, allowing for a kind of quiet and a space apart that I think is really beautiful. Even the composition, setting the bed back from us, offering that space. And so this is also another installation view. And so here, I was particularly interested because the body almost disappears. And so I was wondering if you could talk even a little bit about the making of this particular image and how it fits into the overall story.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this idea of there being a lot more abstraction in these works, or almost a hint of abstraction, right? Even the work before Chrysalis, this idea that there is a figure there, but you don't fully have access because there's sort of this distance and there's sort of this mosquito net and filter shroud between. I was interested in like making pictures that didn't fully give this idea of figuration all the way to the viewer, but left a bit of narrative or moments before, just after the picture for the viewer to come up with on their own. And this picture, I mean, is actually a crop of an image in which friend of mine is actually swimming through mud, and we made sort of a small pool of mud in my studio. It was basically a combination of clay and water. It kind of became like a sandbox and started playing with form and shape and all these other things. And so I like the idea that this fraction of a moment, this crop of a moment, speaks to a larger whole, but also speaks to the movement through, the poetry around and the rippling of the mud, but also sort of this idea of floating or sinking, this idea of being between, right? And the title Rapture, right? So,
Yeah, it's impossible to tell if the hand is emerging or descending. So it provokes a lot of other thoughts and ideas and fits into this beautiful lineage of photographers beginning to abstract the figure while still allowing us to apprehend that there's a body there, but it's viewed differently. And so I think one of the other threads that runs through your work is this way of offering us a moment of recognition, but then filtering it, fuzzying it. And so even in the ways that the space is arranged, so you were saying how you and Antoine came together, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your curatorial process, how it is that you decide what works you're going to pair with what and how they're going to be arranged in space.
Yeah, this was a language I kind of came up with together with Antoine. It was a language, I think when I was making pictures, you're not quite sure how you're going to hang them. You're not quite sure how you're going to come up with putting them together and saying sort of the full sentence of what you're going to say. But at a certain point, I had him over for a studio visit, and it became clear that this show started to feel more like a film than any other show that I had really put together. It felt that there needed to be things put next to one another for things to make sense, and especially this triptych on the left, titled Protect from All Elements, you see motion over time. You sort of see these almost like a film strip in which a boy is sort of pulling a like painted scenic backdrop of a sky over this sort of box of earth, right? So you're seeing these elements, and it's a very abstract moment in the sense that this isn't something you would come across in daily life, but you get the idea of what I'm kind of saying, you know, and this idea of forming one's own horizons, right? Taking matters into one's own hands, right? And all these ideas. So I think the language we came up with was simply from seeing, okay, you have these images that feel a lot more recognizably connected to stuff you've done before, which is what we wanted to talk about. Like, you have these images that are sort of your signature, right? These images of Black folks in nature, but you also have these images of sort of mud and these new ideas. So actually putting them together as diptychs or triptychs sort of really works to get at the...
Like forms a bridge.
Forms a bridge, yeah.
Between.
Yeah.
And so self-decoration number 2 was the one that was showing on the wall across from Protect All Things. But I put these two next to each other again to think about that cinematic quality. So in some ways, it's like a story told over the years of your practice and over multiple gallery shows. So I can imagine, you know, in 50 years, there will be some PhD student who pores over all of them and is like, oh, I see these other arcs that are emerging if you were to bring all of the images of this young man together at once. What kind of film might it make?
Right.
And then I wanted to also continuing to think about curation. So London Frieze, which is an art fair, was like a huge tented art fair in the middle of Regent's Park in London. Something like, I don't know, 1,000 galleries and what felt like 1 million people jammed in. And so I wanted to think about, because at one point you had another arrangement of objects showing inside of that tent, also for Gagosian, but showing some different work. So I thought we could maybe talk a little bit about the difference in the curatorial process in that space, but then also talk about some of these works, because you have some three-dimensional works, a shrine and such in this space.
Yeah, these works, I think, play more with dimensionality and material and sort of object making in a way for photography, still rooted in photography, but this is a continuation of that body of work or that film, so to speak. These are other images in which we're seeing young men contend with landscape, right? There's an image of 2 boys pulling another sky backdrop up over the existing landscape in this sort of grand way. There's an image of sort of the breaking of reality, or almost in this Truman Show-like way. These 2 boys sort of contending with these layered backdrops. So you have, and I think it's called New Horizons.
I think I have an image of that. Yes.
Yeah, this image on the left is sort of, an image in which 2 boys are in a studio environment, but we're seeing a layering of 2 different scenic backdrops. And these are scenic backdrops you rent from a sort of a prop shop or something like that. So the sky backdrop is layered over the city backdrop, and obviously that calls forth all these different ideas of nature in relationship to urban environments in relationship to Blackness, right? And all of those, that sort of search or desire for sort of more space, right? So,
but also it makes really visible the artifice of photography, right? We were talking about earlier the ways we still leap into images and make decisions about the people that are in it without contending with all of the things that had to come together to create that image, including whatever conversation between the sitter and the photographer that allowed that image to come into play. And so the idea of being able to play with the way that you are presented as well is really interesting, but then juxtaposed with, again, this sort of interior moment. And then, again, with mosquito netting, so having these moments that repeat, but I was also very interested in the altar. So, because it was very different than other works that I've seen by you.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a bit about what this object is and what it represents for you.
Yeah, well, this commission and this whole project took place in a part of the Frieze London Fair that's called Frieze Masters. And so Frieze Masters is essentially a part of the fair that is no contemporary artists are really showing there. It's all works from mid-20th century back and earlier, so almost 1600 to 1900 essentially. So I'm basically surrounded by a lot of old painting and a lot of old white painting and a lot of old sort of Dutch or European painting. So this is the first time that Frieze Masters has asked a contemporary artist to do a commission within that fair, in that space. So thinking of the context of that, I made this work, which I think brings together a lot of parts of my practice, which underneath you see books that I've sort of curated and assembled and put together in the work that are my own touchstones, like we sort of spoke about, books by James Barner, Theaster Gates. They're almost research books, right? They're almost history and point to the lineage that came before. And then you have situated on top as this sort of like domestic, almost mantelpiece, right? Because the shape kind of calls forth ideas of the mantle in the home of a Brooklyn brownstone or something like that, but also a bookshelf. You have my own work. So the work kind of sums up what the commission was also about, which was my work in dialogue with the past. And this was me forming my own sort of lineage within the context of that fair, right? The things that inspired me, but then also my new works.
Perfect, thank you. And since we are going to start wrapping up so that we can have time for questions and answer, we've talked a little bit about where you were when making this body of work, but I wanted to think about where you're headed. So this was sort of the last image that I saw inside of that Free Space Cage 2, it's called. So like the image of the young woman, it has the sort of artificial, well, the young woman had the artificial backdrop that was called Cage. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this image and then where your practice is heading.
Yeah, I think that, this work and the work in general also contends with this idea of what's real, like what's real and what's not real. So like, I've always talked a lot about a problem I've had with photography, which is that it's burdened by so many facts, right? This need to know where an image is made, who is in the image, what's the person's relationship to the photographer, how true is the moment, right? This search for sort of truth or these constructs of intimacy, right? The idea that image made of a family member being more intimate than of a stranger, right? Which, all of those things hold up in photography. But I think my work is sort of headed in this place where I'm playing with ideas of artifice and reality. And by that I mean, I've iterated on an image now, whether that be with an artificial background or really in nature, and these ideas of emotionality, interiority, mental space, like those things, this not being a real environment in which he was just hanging out and I found him there, but that being more true than the truth itself sometimes when you set something up. I guess that's where my work is headed, is exploring all these ideas of how photography can be a little less burdened by facts and a little bit more of a storytelling tool.
Yeah, thank you. Fantastic. And with that, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. There's microphones at either side, but also thank you so much, Tyler.
Thank you.
I have a question about your muses and the folks that you capture. So thinking about the history of Black people in film or Black people being captured, and just the language we even use around photography in general, do you have an ethic, like a specific kind of maybe even written out ethic around creating and making photographs of Black people?
No, the answer is no. There's no ethic or rule book. But I'm interested, I think we can all recognize an image in which someone who has been photographed has agency or not, right? And I think this is part of Kijo's work, and this is what we were just kind of backstage talking about, is like this idea that over time there's been a large canon of images in which Black people have sort of been stripped of their agency, right? Their ability to hold authorship over certain images, right? What's been initiated, or what has felt initiated by the photographer versus the sitter. So I try to make all of my work as much of a collaborative sort of process as possible, in which the sitter's gaze becomes this powerful tool for agency for them, right? The eye contact with the camera or with the viewer, or sometimes the refusal of that being very intentional and being something that is powerfully their own, right? And my own in making the work. So the answer is no rule book, but I think I'm interested in trying to make photographs in which we see young Black men and women sort of claiming their own agency, personhood. Yeah.
Please.
Sorry, I'm like kind of losing my voice here. But I first want to say thank you. For many of us in here, we're probably seeing your work on Instagram or online, and I appreciate all the work that was put into this, because seeing your and hearing you in the space, like some of your work looks very Midwestern in a way. So it's added to you being as aspirational as I already felt about you. But my question is, you have we know imagery is powerful. If that weren't true, we wouldn't be here. But in terms of working with imaging and images, doing something like a celebrity profile like Beyoncé, how much have you had to consider her image that's already in the zeitgeist, and did that allow you enough space to keep your narrative?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I feel somewhat either lucky or, I don't know, by nature or by nurture, fixated on only doing commissions or photographs that speak to me. So, I mean, the exciting thing about a commission like photographing Beyoncé is that there was space for my voice there. She allowed for it, the magazine allowed for it, and I think we all knew that in being called and asked to do that type of a commission, it was really, there was no other way for me to photograph her than the way that I knew how to photograph my friends and other people around me in my life, right? So there wasn't this sort of years and years of training as a sort of formal fashion or portrait photographer to work off of. It was more of an emotional point of view. It was more of a personal point of view, and it was more of how I bring these sort of unguarded but beautiful moments of everyday life into my work. So I feel fortunate and honored to have been asked to do that, and honored also to have been given space to basically do what I do in that sort of a commissioned space.
Can I ask Tyler, Ben, have you ever had a moment where you've had to say no to a commission because there was no room for your voice?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Almost all the time.
Yeah. So you've been very sort of selective from the start.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and it's now become clear to the people around me that I work with and my collaborators that, a friend of mine says it's very clear that you're interested in the things you're interested in, and you're not very interested in the things you're not interested in. And when something kind of turns you off, you just sort of shut down. So yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you. Please.
Sorry, I think I had to bring it down a little bit.
No problem.
Given that a lot of artists have like a certain message when it comes to their work, and from, when you have a show and artists or like your fans or new spectators look at your work, and if the message gets misconstrued in a way, can that get like a little confusing or frustrating for you, or does it open a new conversation for future works?
No, not at all. I think, the beauty of photography and this work, and even being in this museum, is the idea that there are thousands, hundreds of interpretations of a work of art, that there are hundreds of interpretations of a photograph, that a photograph is not dictating to anyone what to think or feel about it, and if that's what you mean. And I think that, the sort of art's only task, or hopefully, is to kind of change consciousness, right? It's not about being didactic or about sort of even necessarily policy change or specifically activism in the community organizing way, but more in a consciousness way, in a bodily way, and in a visceral way. So if my pictures can do that, I think that's great, and I'm not particularly prescriptive about what people then think or if that makes yeah.
Hey Tyler, I got the chance to meet you yesterday, and I got to show you my art. My question for you is, what advice could you give to the Black artists trying to make a name for themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I could speak from the point of view of my own experience and sort of speak from what I felt has worked or not worked, or things that are working, is outreach. I think for me, a lot of what I have found to be very useful is simply and purely reaching out to a lot of the people that I find inspirational, reaching out to a lot of the people that I hope to work with, reaching out to people that look interesting to me, that I would like to photograph. I think I was talking yesterday about I saw these two twin sisters at a concert that they had done their own hair in a way that I found like captivating and fascinating. Like, I'm just trying to constantly extend the network of people that I'm either in touch with or reaching out to, trying to photograph. So I think as much as you can sort of putting yourself out there, as simple as that sort of sounds, it's easier said than done, is important and helpful. It has been helpful to me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Oh, hey, Bree.
Hey, Kijo. I had a question about rest and like respite, but also I was curious about the role of fantasy in your work. So I'm wondering about like how you position like memories from your own childhood into pictures that you create of like contemporary childhood.
Yeah. Memory, right? And the function of memory.
Yeah.
I think, this is a tough one because memories are so loose. And I think the idea that like growing up in Atlanta, essentially a lot of my memories, whether they're sort of fully true or not, are really about the fact that parks were nearby, that green areas were near me, that grass, that trees were such a part of my experience in that city, right? That as much as being in a metropolis was important to my upbringing, so was nature. And the idea that I've decided to make most of my pictures focus on that element of my memory, sort of selective memory in a way. But I hope through making these images of Black people contending or experiencing or being in relationship to nature that I'm expanding the sort of narrative around. Even saying that biographically I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, and make this kind of work can be kind of an interesting and expansive conversation, if that makes sense. Because I think a lot of the images that come to mind of Atlanta or a metropolis like that is sort of almost a hyper-urban, and an image that we are a lot more familiar with, that is like no less valid, but that there can be this space for another side of sort of Black memory or sort of Black consciousness or narrative and all of those things.
It makes me think, I come from Newark, New Jersey, and so the notion that, you fly into Newark, it is the worst part of Newark to fly into, chemical smells, the Anheuser-Busch plant. But I grew up across the street from a park.
Right.
So that's what's missing from the sort of mediated images of those spaces.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry. Hi. So I guess I wanted to ask, I guess racial identity affects like so many different parts of life. It affects so many different people in a different way. And I was just wondering how you choose like which aspects of racial identity you want to highlight, and if those themes kind of change as you make your work.
Yeah, I think that for me, like, the biggest thing is to speak from personal experience. The biggest thing is to think about memory. I think, as we were just talking about, I think the biggest thing that has driven or inspired my work as of lately is to think about how I grew up, how I was first seen or experienced through the lens of race, but not only that, how I was seen as a person. and also the spaces in which I've felt personally the most free or sort of liberated, right? And all of these ideas. So I think I speak first and foremost from personal experience, and then allow the work, hopefully through that, to be sort of universally understood, or at least that people can kind of find something of themselves in the work. So through the specifics of my experience, hopefully that relates or connects or cuts through to other people's experience, if that makes sense. And I think that also I'm a disciple and student and forever indebted to Deborah Willis, who has just exposed me to a pantheon of image makers who have considered race as being central to their own identity and work in a way that has never been pejorative, right? Because I think there's also this conversation to be had around, a highly contentious one around the idea that to make your work about race is to sort of put it on some sort of a lower pedestal, or, right? Any of these connotations that have existed through time. And artists again and again have debunked that idea.
Well, it's also, you know, because the notion that somehow white artists are able to be neutral in their making, and that whiteness does not factor into that making is a fallacy. So there's a way in which that, yes, the idea of talking about race through one's work places it on a lower rung is simply anti-blackness, because it means it's a notion that is steeped in the idea that producing out of blackness is somehow always already inferior. So that allows us to sort of leave that out of the equation.
Exactly.
I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
And to call oneself a black artist, right?
Right, and to call oneself that, yes. Yes. I think we have time for this, who's in line right now. Okay.
Hello. I just wanted to know if, because of your early inspirations like Paul Thomas Anderson, Spike Jonze, and like the film-like quality of your artwork protect from all elements, if you would ever venture into the world of filmmaking.
Yeah, that's certainly an interest. I moved to New York to go to film school. And so in that way, I kind of thought I was headed for just making films, right? Didn't think that photography was in the picture, pun intended. And so I guess, yeah, it's certainly an interest and a goal and something I've thought about, and it's something I'm interested and excited by. And I also love, I sort of just see myself as an image person, you know, moving or still, and don't really separate or make some sort of hierarchy out of either. So the answer, I guess, is yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Tyler. I am just about to finish Edward Inniful's memoir, and I'm wondering if your paths have ever crossed in your fashion work, and if they have or haven't, how maybe has his work influenced you?
Yeah, it's funny because I basically met Edward 2 weeks ago, not even a week or two ago. So we are getting to know each other, and he is obviously a pioneering figure, inspirational figure, and extremely influential figure. But it's funny because I have to be somewhat honest that fashion really wasn't a part of my sort of like wheelhouse or reference book or sort of anchors. As a kid, I wasn't necessarily thumbing through the pages of Vogue or ID as sort of how I was foundationally understanding myself. So I can't really speak to the fact that, I can't speak to the fact that he was working on me in that way at that time, but I am in such admiration of what he's doing now and understanding more and want to read his memoir as well. So yeah, I think that like in so many fields right now, we are now either uncovering, celebrating, right? Sort of people who have been doing the work for a long, long, long time, and he's one of those.
Thank you. Last question.
I'm curious about your thought process. How do you actually figure out that, you know, clay and water would look better on film versus other media sources? Just your thought process.
Yeah, I don't know if better or worse. I think that clay and mud and all these elements, I just try to think about how to render them the best way I knew how. you know, if that makes sense, with the tools that I have with with a camera, essentially, and with certain light and with film, which is just the way that I've been working for years. And I think that I found that as an element, it became a really powerful way to sort of talk about, again, these ideas of sort of psychological repression or sort of this sort of more threatening side of natural elements, right? And all the other connotations around water, mud, sinking, floating, the conversation around swimming. So I think it was less visual or sort of like, here's the best way, but it was more about a storytelling tool that I found really powerful in the mud, yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Tyler, so much. And I think we're inviting Barbara back up.
Yep. Great. Our calls come out now.
Thank you. I hope you'll take the opportunity to have some light refreshments and some casual conversation with our speakers in the private dining room following this. And of course, the museum stays open till 5. If you haven't had a chance to see the show upstairs, or if you want to see it again, please come and visit it. Thank you very much.